On August 31st, 2023, a startling financial figure was finally made public in court. Lawyers for the U.S. Virgin Islands revealed that J.P. Morgan Chase processed over $1 billion for Jeffrey Epstein. This was not a rumor from a tabloid, but a verified fact entered into the federal court record. For 16 years, the American banking system served as the engine for a global criminal enterprise. The $1 billion figure represents the total volume of transactions that flowed through his accounts. This massive sum included wire transfers, cash withdrawals, and securities, trading over a decade and a half. It proves that the financial giants of Wall Street were not just passive observers of his crimes. They were active participants who profited from the movement of his money across international borders daily. If you want the unvarnished truth about how money works in America, you need to subscribe now. Hit the notification bell so you are alerted the moment we release these deep financial dives. We read the court documents that the mainstream media ignores to bring you the raw data. Leave a comment below telling us if you think the banks have been held accountable yet. I read every single comment to understand how this financial injustice sits with you personally. The revelation of the $1 billion figure changed the entire scope of the Epstein scandal forever. Before this, we knew he was rich, but we did not know the velocity of his money. The lawsuit filed by the U.S. Virgin Islands alleged that J.P. Morgan prioritized profits over federal law. They claimed that the bank knowingly facilitated the operations of a sex trafficking ring for years. The bank generated millions in fees from his accounts while ignoring the most obvious red flags. Internal bank records showed that Epstein opened his first account at the bank in 1998. Over the next 15 years, that single relationship expanded into a complex web of 50 separate accounts. These accounts were held in the names of various shell companies and trusts to obscure ownership. Entities with vague names like Plan D LLC and Hyperion Air were used to move funds. The sheer volume of money moving through these accounts should have triggered immediate fraud alerts instantly, but the court documents show that the compliance systems failed because human executives overruled them repeatedly. This is the most terrifying aspect of the scandal for the average American bank customer today. When you deposit $10,000 in cash, you're immediately flagged by federal anti-laundering laws. You're questioned about the source of funds and often treated like a potential criminal suspect. But when Epstein moved millions of dollars, the rules were bent to accommodate his high status. The most damning evidence came from the records of his physical cash withdrawals over the years. Between 2005 and 2017, he withdrew massive amounts of paper currency regularly. We are talking about withdrawals ranging from $40,000 to $80,000 every single month. In total, he took out over $1.7 million in hard cash from teller windows. Bank policies strictly require that such large cash transactions be scrutinized for money laundering risks. The bank is legally obligated to ask what the money is for and verify the answer. But in this case, the massive cash piles were simply handed over without adequate due diligence. The lawsuit alleged that this cash was the lifeblood of his trafficking operation on the ground. It was used to pay recruiters and victims in a way that left no digital paper trail. By providing this cash, the bank was effectively the logistics partner for his criminal activities globally. The failure to stop these withdrawals was not an accident, it was a deliberate business choice. Internal emails unsealed during the lawsuit reveal a culture of willful blindness at the highest levels. In 2008, Epstein was convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor in Florida court. Standard banking procedure dictates that a convicted felon, especially a sex offender, is a high risk. Normally, the bank would immediately close the accounts to protect its reputation from the inevitable scandal. But senior executives at J.P. Morgan discussed the situation and decided to keep him as a client. They explicitly weighed the reputational risk against the financial reward of his deep connections. Epstein was not just a client, he was a connector to other billionaires and potential customers. He introduced the bank to some of the wealthiest people on the planet during his tenure. The executives did not want to lose access to that Rolodex by offending him with closure. One email from a senior banker even discussed giving Epstein a fresh start after his jail time. This phrase, fresh start, became a symbol of the moral rot inside the compliance department. It showed that for the right price, even a conviction for abusing children could be overlooked. The bank continued to process his transactions for another 5 years after his initial conviction. During this time, hundreds of millions of dollars continued to flow through the accounts unimpeded. It was only in 2013 that the bank finally decided to sever ties with him, but even then the decision was made quietly and without alerting federal authorities to the suspicious activity. The bank did not file suspicious activity reports known as SARs at the time of the crimes. These reports are the primary mechanism that the U.S. government uses to catch money launderers. By failing to file them, the bank effectively shielded Epstein from the eyes of the Treasury Department. It was only after he died in 2019 that the bank suddenly filed the reports. They filed a flurry of retrospective SRs covering years of activity that had already happened. This move was seen by regulators as a cynical attempt to cover their tracks after the fact. They wanted to look compliant after the scandal had already broken in the national news. But the damage was already done, and the victims had already suffered for decades in silence. The financial infrastructure that allowed Epstein to operate was not limited to just one bank. When J.P. Morgan closed his accounts, Deutsche Bank stepped in to fill the void immediately. The German banking giant was eager to expand its presence in the U.S. wealth management market. They took on Epstein as a client, despite knowing his criminal history and his previous bank exit. They saw an opportunity to make money where others had finally decided the risk was too high. Over the next 5 years, Deutsche Bank processed millions more for the Epstein network globally. They too ignored the red flags of massive cash withdrawals and payments to suspicious entities. They too failed to properly monitor the movement of funds to Russian models and other women. The pattern of behavior across these institutions reveals a systemic failure in American banking compliance. It suggests that the rules are designed to police the poor while protecting the rich. The compliance officers who tried to do their jobs were often silenced or overruled by bosses. The court documents mention low-level employees who flagged the transactions but were ignored by management. These employees saw the suspicious activity and tried to raise the alarm through proper channels, but their warnings died on the desks of senior executives who were focused on quarterly bonuses. The settlement that JP Morgan agreed to pay in June 2023 was an admission of failure. $290 million is a massive sum of money even for a giant bank. It is one of the largest settlements ever paid in a human trafficking case in history. But the bank did not admit to intentional wrongdoing in the legal language of the settlement. They admitted that they made a mistake in keeping him as a client for so long. They admitted that their historical compliance procedures were not up to the standard required. This careful legal phrasing allows them to pay the fine without admitting to criminal liability. It is a cost of doing business that gets absorbed into the balance sheet at year end. But for the victims and the American public, the payment confirms the truth of the allegations. It confirms that the $1 billion that moved through those accounts was indeed dirty money. The financial analysis of these transactions shows a network that was designed to be opaque. Epstein used the banking system to create layers of separation between himself and his payments. He used trusts and shell companies to make it difficult to trace the ultimate beneficiary. But the banks had the data and the legal power to see through these layers. They had the know your customer obligations that required them to understand who was getting paid. They chose not to look too closely because looking would have required them to act. The $1 billion figure is a testament to the scale of the failure we witnessed. It turns the Epstein story from a tabloid scandal into a structural indictment of Wall Street. It shows that the mechanisms of global finance can be weaponized by predators with sufficient capital. The banks are the gatekeepers of the financial system, and they left the gate wide open. They allowed a known predator to operate inside the fortress of American banking for 16 years. This failure has shaken the trust of the public in the integrity of the financial system. It raises the question of whose money is really safe and whose is being monitored today. The double standard is what makes this story so infuriating for the average taxpayer watching. We are told that the banking system is safe and regulated and secure for everyone, but the Epstein files prove that safety is a commodity that is sold to the highest bidder. As we dig deeper into the specifics of the transactions, the picture gets even darker. The specific payments to individuals and the timing of the transfers tell a chilling story. We can see the correlation between the movement of money and the movement of victims. The bank accounts were the logistical backbone of the entire operation from start to finish. Without the ability to wire money globally, the network would have been paralyzed instantly. The banks provided the liquidity and the legitimacy that Epstein needed to maintain his lifestyle. They were the silent partners in a business that traded in human misery for decades. And now we are finally seeing the receipts that prove exactly how much it cost. The investigation into the banking records revealed a shocking personal alliance at the very top. Unsealed court documents exposed a deep relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and executive Jess Staley. Staley was the powerful head of the private bank at JP Morgan during the critical years. He was the man responsible for managing the fortunes of the wealthiest clients in America. The internal emails recovered by investigators show that he was also Epstein's closest banking ally. Over a period of years, the two men exchanged more than 1,200 emails. These were not standard business communications about interest rates or portfolio allocations or stock trends. They were intimate messages that included photos and cryptic references to women using code names. One particularly disturbing exchange featured the phrase, "Say hi to Snow White" in the subject line. This code name was allegedly used to refer to one of the victims in the network. The sheer volume of communication suggests that the banker and the client were deeply intertwined. Staley visited Epstein at his private island in the Caribbean on multiple occasions over the years. He also visited him at his townhouse in New York and his Palm Beach mansion frequently. Most shockingly, he visited Epstein at his office while he was on work release from jail. At the very moment Epstein was serving time for sex crimes, his banker was visiting him. This visual of a top Wall Street executive meeting a convict tells you everything you need. It proves that for the financial elite, the stigma of prison does not apply to them. Staley later left JP Morgan to become the chief executive officer of Barclays in the United Kingdom. But the ghost of this relationship followed him across the ocean and eventually destroyed his career. In October 2023, he was banned from the British banking industry for life. Regulators concluded that he had misled them about the true nature of his relationship with Epstein. But for years inside JP Morgan, he was the impenetrable shield that protected the accounts from closure. The lawsuit alleged that junior compliance officers tried to flag the accounts repeatedly and aggressively. They saw the cash withdrawals and the wire transfers to shell companies and raised the alarm. But every time they pushed to close the accounts, they hit a wall of executive protection. Staley was the senior figure who argued that Epstein was too valuable to lose as client. He successfully blocked the risk management department from offboarding the predator for nearly a decade. This internal civil war between the safety team and the profit team is the real scandal. It shows that a single powerful executive can override the entire compliance infrastructure of a bank. The checks and balances that are supposed to stop money laundering failed because of one man. But eventually even Staley could not protect the accounts from the mounting pressure of the compliance team. In 2013, JP Morgan finally made the decision to formally exit the relationship for good. But this exit was not the end of Epstein's access to the global financial system at all. This is where the story shifts to the second giant of Wall Street, Deutsche Bank, immediately. The German bank saw the exit of JP Morgan not as a warning, but as an opportunity. They were desperate to expand their wealth management business in the United States market at any cost. They actively courted Epstein to bring his millions and his connections to their institution in New York. Internal documents show that they knew exactly why JP Morgan had fired him as a client then. They knew about the criminal conviction and the high-risk designation attached to his name. But the lure of the fees and the access to his billionaire friends was too strong. They opened dozens of accounts for him and his shell companies almost immediately after the rejection. For the next 5 years, Deutsche Bank became the primary financial engine for the criminal enterprise. The patterns of suspicious activity that had occurred at the first bank simply continued at the second. The massive cash withdrawals continued to flow out of teller windows without adequate questions asked. Payments to suspicious entities in Eastern Europe and Russia continued to be processed without delay. The bank's monitoring systems generated alerts, but the human operators resolved them without taking action. One compliance officer famously wrote in an email that they could not find any negative news. This claim was made years after his conviction was public record and widely known by everyone. It demonstrates a level of willful blindness that borders on criminal negligence by the bank staff. The relationship with Deutsche Bank only ended in late 2018 as federal heat increased. They paid a $75 million settlement to victims in 2023 for their role. But the banking records also exposed a third pillar of the support network, the government itself. The U.S. Virgin Islands lawsuit revealed that Epstein had captured the local political system completely. He was not just a resident of the islands, he was their most important financial patron. Emails showed that he was on a first-name basis with the highest officials in government. He paid the tuition for the children of government aides and provided other financial benefits regularly. His most critical relationship was with the First Lady of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Cecile de Jong. The documents revealed that she worked for Epstein as an office manager for years. He paid her hundreds of thousands of dollars while her husband was the serving governor there. This payment was effectively a salary for political protection, disguised as a consulting fee for services. In exchange for this money, the local government looked the other way for a decade. They gave him massive tax breaks that saved him hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes. They granted him expedited building permits for his island construction projects without standard environmental review. Most importantly, they allowed him to travel in and out of the territory without scrutiny. The airports and the ports were wide open to him because he owned the political class. This trifecta of a major U.S. bank, a major German bank, and a captured government was unstoppable. It created a zone of immunity where the laws of the United States did not apply. The compliance failures at the banks were mirrored by the regulatory failures of the territory government. It was a perfect closed loop of corruption funded by the $1 billion in flow. The victims were trapped inside this loop with no one to turn to for help. If they went to the police reported to the politicians Epstein was paying off. If they tried to follow the money, the banks were processing it without asking any questions. This is why the financial aspect of this crime is just as heinous as the physical. The money was the chain that held the entire operation together for 20 long years. Without the wire transfers to pay the pilots and the recruiters, the network collapses instantly. Without the cash to pay the bribes and the tips, the silence is broken immediately. The banks provided the logistical support that made the industrial scale of the abuse possible. And they did it for fees that were a rounding error on their balance sheets. The millions they earned from Epstein were nothing compared to the billions they managed daily, yet they sold their integrity and the safety of children for that small slice of profit. The settlement amounts of $290 million and $75 million sound large to us, but to a bank that makes billions in profit every quarter, it is just a fine. It is the cost of doing business in a world where moral hazards are priced in. The lack of personal criminal charges for the bankers involved is the final insult here. Jess Staley was banned from banking and lost his job, but he did not face prison. The compliance officers who ignored the alerts were fired, but they were not prosecuted for aiding. The system protects its own even when the evidence of wrongdoing is overwhelming and public. This story forces us to look at the reality of the two-tiered justice system today. If a teller steals $100 from the drawer, they go to jail immediately. But if an executive facilitates $1 billion in suspicious flows, they get a retirement package. The disparity in consequences is what drives the anger of the American public right now. We see the rules being applied with brutal efficiency to the poor and working class. But those same rules become flexible guidelines when they are applied to the ultra-wealthy. The Epstein files are not just about one man, they are about the system that built him. They are an indictment of the culture of Wall Street that prioritizes revenue above human life. As we prepare to look at the specific payouts to billionaires, the picture gets darker. The banks were just the plumbing, but the billionaires were the ones turning the taps. We need to understand exactly who was paying Epstein and what they were buying with it. The mystery of the massive consulting fees is the final piece of this horrific puzzle. The trail of money eventually leads us away from the banks and directly to the billionaires themselves. While the banks were the plumbing of this operation, the billionaires were the ones turning the tap. The most shocking financial revelation involves one of the most powerful men in private equity history. Leon Black was the founder of Apollo Global Management, a firm that manages hundreds of billions. He was a titan of Wall Street, who commanded respect in every boardroom in New York City. But financial records revealed that he paid Jeffrey Epstein $158 million. This is an astronomical sum of money for any kind of professional service in any industry. To put it in perspective, it is more than the annual salary of almost every CEO in America. The explanation given for this massive payment was that it was for tax and estate planning advice. Black claimed that Epstein had a unique proprietary strategy to save him money on taxes. Specifically, he helped structure a grantor-retained annuity trust, known as a GRAT, for his children. This trust structure allegedly saved Black nearly $2 billion in future estate taxes legally. But the sheer size of the fee raised immediate red flags with investigators and compliance experts. Tax lawyers and accountants typically charge hourly rates or fixed fees, not hundreds of millions. The independent review conducted by the law firm Desher LLP scrutinized these payments in detail. They found that there was no written contract for many of the services Epstein allegedly provided. The payments were made in irregular chunks, often appearing as if they were settled on a handshake. This lack of documentation is highly unusual for a man who runs a rigorous investment firm. The fallout from these revelations was swift and brutal for the private equity titan. Leon Black was forced to step down as the chief executive officer of the firm he founded. His reputation was permanently stained by the association with the convicted sex offender. But the payments raise a deeper question about the role Epstein played in the financial ecosystem. He was not just a social climber, he was a fixer for the ultra-wealthy elite. He solved problems that traditional lawyers and accountants were too afraid or too ethical to touch. He operated in the gray zones of the tax code where billions of dollars can be hidden. And for this service, he extracted a fee that allowed him to maintain his lavish lifestyle. But Leon Black was not the only billionaire who gave Epstein the keys to the castle. We must look at the case of Leslie Wexner, the founder of L Brands and Victoria's Secret. In 1991, Wexner signed a document that is almost unprecedented in the business world. He gave Epstein full power of attorney over his entire personal fortune and legal affairs. This legal instrument gave Epstein the authority to hire people, sell assets, and move money. He could sign checks and buy property and borrow money in Wexner's name without asking permission. It is baffling why a self-made billionaire would hand over total control to a former teacher. For nearly 2 decades, Epstein used this power to embed himself in Wexner's financial life. He used Wexner's money to buy the townhouse in New York that became the center of the ring. He used Wexner's private plane to transport victims across state lines and international borders. He even used his connection to the Victoria's Secret brand to lure aspiring models into his trap. Wexner later claimed that Epstein had misappropriated vast sums of his money during this time. He severed ties in 2007, but by then, the damage was already done completely. The power of attorney document is the smoking gun that proves Epstein's access was absolute. He did not need to steal the money, he was legally authorized to spend it as he saw fit. This relationship provided the seed capital that allowed Epstein to pretend he was a brilliant investor. In reality, he was simply spending other people's money to build his own facade of wealth. But the network of enablers extended beyond just the men who paid him directly. It included the hedge fund managers who welcomed him into their inner circles socially. Glenn Dubin, the co-founder of Highbridge Capital, was another key figure in this orbit. Epstein had helped facilitate the sale of Highbridge to J.P. Morgan in 2004. This deal made Dubin a billionaire and cemented Epstein's status as a power broker. The Dubin family maintained a relationship with Epstein long after his first conviction in Florida. They invited him to Thanksgiving dinner and allowed him to remain part of their social lives. This normalization of a known predator is what allowed him to operate in plain sight. If the billionaires treated him as a friend, then the banks treated him as a client. It was a reinforcing loop of validation that shielded him from scrutiny for decades. But eventually the house of cards collapsed and the bill finally came due for the estate. After Epstein died in a jail cell in Manhattan, the process of liquidation began slowly. His estate was valued at approximately $600 million at the time of his death. But the victims who had been silenced for so long finally had their day in court. The Epstein Victims Compensation Program was established to provide restitution to the survivors. Over the course of the program, it paid out more than $121 million. Approximately 135 victims received payments from this fund for their suffering. This was the first time that the money he had hoarded was used to help the people he hurt. But the payments could never truly compensate for the lives that were destroyed by his actions. To fund these payments, the executors had to sell off the trophies of his criminal life. The townhouse in New York City, which was valued at nearly $90 million, was sold. It went for $51 million, a steep discount due to its horrific history. The proceeds from this sale went directly into the fund to pay the victims and creditors. The infamous Palm Beach mansion was sold to a developer for $18 million. The new owner immediately demolished the property to erase the physical memory of the crimes. Even the private islands in the U.S. Virgin Islands were put on the market for sale. Little St. James and Great St. James were listed for $125 million. These islands were the headquarters of the operation where the worst abuses took place. The sale of these assets marked the final physical dismantling of the Epstein empire. But the financial dismantling is still ongoing as lawsuits continue to work through the courts. The settlements with the banks were just the first wave of accountability we have seen. There are still legal battles regarding the role of other enablers and institutions involved. The U.S. Virgin Islands government itself settled for $105 million for its role. They admitted to failures in supervision that allowed Epstein to operate with impunity there. This payout came from the taxpayers of the territory who were betrayed by their leaders. The total cost of this scandal is now measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the true cost is the erosion of trust in the entire global financial system. We now know that the banks we trust with our savings are capable of laundering dirty money. We know that the billionaires we admire are capable of financing unspeakable crimes against children. We know that the regulators who are supposed to protect us are often asleep at the wheel. The Epstein files have peeled back the curtain on a world that was never meant to be seen. It is a world where money is the only morality and profit is the only God. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work for the people inside it. It protected the wealthy and it exploited the vulnerable with ruthless efficiency every day. The only reason we know any of this is because the victims refused to stay silent. They fought for decades against a legal system that was stacked against them at every turn. Their courage forced the release of the documents that exposed the banks and the billionaires. They forced the world to look at the ugly truth of how our financial system actually operates. As we move forward, we must demand real changes to the laws that govern banking. We cannot allow too big to jail to remain the standard operating procedure for Wall Street. We need personal liability for the executives who sign off on these criminal relationships. If a banker facilitates trafficking, they should face the same prison time as the trafficker. We need an end to the opaque trusts and shell companies that hide illicit wealth. Transparency is the only disinfectant that can clean up the rot in the system. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not just a true crime story, it is a financial story. It is a warning about what happens when vast wealth is allowed to operate without oversight. The $1 billion that flow through those accounts is a stain on American history. It is a reminder that the love of money is indeed the root of all kinds of evil, but it is also a call to action for every citizen to demand better from our institutions. We must not let the news cycle move on and forget the lessons of this scandal. We must keep the pressure on the regulators and the lawmakers to close the loopholes. Because if we do not fix this system, another Epstein will inevitably rise again soon. The machinery of Wall Street is still there waiting for the next client with cash. The compliance departments are still understaffed and overruled by the profit seekers. The billionaires are still looking for ways to hide their money from the tax man. Nothing has fundamentally changed in the structure of the financial world since this happened. That is why we must remain vigilant and informed about where our money is going. We have the power to vote with our wallets and our ballots to demand change. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive into the darkness of finance. This is a story that needed to be told in full detail to be understood. If you found this investigation valuable, please share this video to spread the truth. The algorithm often suppresses content that is critical of the powerful financial interests, so we rely on you to help us get this message out to the world. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a future update from us. We will continue to follow the money wherever it leads, no matter who it implicates. Leave a comment below with your final thoughts on the banking system after hearing this. Do you trust the banks to do the right thing, or is the system broken? I will be reading your comments and responding to as many as I can tonight. Thank you for watching and for caring about the truth in a world of lies. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your money safe from the system.